Kethvar had never lost a mark. This was not reputation. Reputation was what people built from selected facts, arranged carefully, told to the right ears in the right order. What Kethvar had was a record, which was different. A record was what remained when you subtracted everything that could be arranged or selected or told carefully. It was just the number. 94 marks taken, 94. 94 beings across 11 species, 43 planetary environments, a career spanning 22 years. Taken in jungles and in cities, in vacuum and in atmosphere. Across distances that had required months of patience, and in rooms that had required seconds of decision. Taken alive when the contract specified alive, confirmed when confirmation was required. Turned over to clients who had paid very large amounts of currency for the certainty that Kethvar's record provided. The certainty was the product, not the taking itself. The certainty that the taking would happen, that the number would increment. That the mark would not reach wherever the mark was trying to reach, Kethvar charged accordingly. The contract for the 95th mark had arrived through the standard channels with the standard anonymization, which Kethvar had come to expect from clients who were either very cautious or very prominent. The contract was for a human, Concordance military intelligence, attached to a courier operation, carrying data that the client wanted and that the mark was transporting to a Concordance relay station in the outer reaches. The contract specified alive and intact, which was the more difficult specification. Dead was simple. Alive and intact required margin, required precision, required the kind of judgment that distinguished professionals from the more numerous category of beings who believed they were professionals. The dossier on the mark was standard. Name, Yael Rosen. Rank, Specialist. Concordance Military Intelligence Division. Age, 29 standard years. Physical parameters, human baseline, unremarkable. Training record, standard ME-Track with field certification. No special operations designation. No augmentation on file. Kethvar read the dossier with the professional attention that every dossier received and the professional skepticism that had kept the record at 94. The physical parameters were always the least useful part of a dossier. Beings moved differently than their physical parameters predicted. They made decisions that their training records didn't anticipate. The record was useful for building an initial model, which was all it was. A starting point that the actual tracking would revise. The outer reaches courier route was documented. The relay station was a known location. The corridor between them had limited options for transit given the regional shipping infrastructure. Kethvar began the way the record was built, methodically, without assumptions about timeline, because assumptions about timeline were where records ended. Day one began before the mark knew she was being tracked. This was standard. The optimal engagement geometry was always from ahead, not behind. Not pursuit, positioning. Let the mark move through terrain you already control. Have already read, have already mapped for angles and cover and the specific places where a being in transit becomes. For one predictable moment, manageable. Kethvar had identified 3 such positions along the most probable transit corridor. The mark would use one of them. The transit route had limited options. The cargo she was carrying specified a timeline. The timeline constrained the route. Kethvar took the first position and waited. The wait was not long. Rosen appeared at the transit corridor's entry point approximately 4 hours after Kethvar had settled into the first position. She was moving at a good pace, carrying a midweight pack, dressed for the terrain with the practical attention of someone who had done this before, Kethvar observed. The first thing to observe was how a mark moved, not the route, not the speed, how they moved through the space around them. Whether They were looking at the ground in front of them or the ground around them. Whether they paused at elevated positions, whether they took cover approaches to open areas, whether their head moved the way it moved when someone was checking ambient space, or the way it moved when someone was thinking about something else, Rosen moved well. Not the movement of someone running a trained security protocol, the deliberate systematic awareness that me training produced, and that was, paradoxically, one of the more readable movement signatures, because it followed a pattern. Her movement was something less formal and more integrated. She was reading the terrain, not checking it, reading it. The difference was the speed and continuity of the attention, the way her eyes moved before her body did, the way she adjusted her line without breaking rhythm when the adjustment was small enough not to require a conscious decision. Kethvar noted this and updated the model. She was field experienced in a way her training record didn't fully capture. The field certification on her dossier was accurate, but insufficient. There was more than certification in the way she moved. There was habit. Kethvar settled in and waited for the first position opportunity. The first position opportunity did not materialize. Not because the geometry was wrong. The geometry was correct. The position Kethvar had selected was sound. The problem was that Rosen did not move through the position the way the corridor's limited options suggested she would. She took a line that was neither of the two optimal transit paths, and not the obvious compromise between them. She took a line that used the terrain's edge, where the transit corridor met a rocky outgrowth that the mapping data showed as impassable. In a way that the mapping data did not predict was possible. It was possible, barely, and requiring specific knowledge of the terrain's actual surface conditions versus the mapped conditions, but possible. She moved through the impassable outgrowth in 11 minutes and came out on the far side of the first position. Kethvar watched her go and updated the model again. She had not detected the position. Her line had not been evasive. She had simply used the terrain differently than the terrain suggested it should be used. Based on something she knew about it that the maps didn't capture. How did she know it? Kethvar moved to the second position and thought about this while moving. The second position was stronger, less dependent on the mark's specific transit line. It covered more approach angles, and the terrain options that funneled toward it were more constrained. Rosen appeared at the second position's outer edge for hours. After the first position failure, she stopped. Not the stop of someone who had detected a threat and was reacting, a different stop. The stop of someone who had noticed something and was thinking about it. She stood at the edge of the second position's approach zone for 3 minutes, not looking at the zone, looking at the terrain around it, at the specific configuration of cover and angles that made it the correct tactical choice for someone watching a transit corridor. Then she took a different line, not away from the position, around it, a long approach that added 40 minutes to her transit time and brought her to the far side of the position from a direction that negated the position's coverage geometry. She had not seen Kethvar. The cover was sound. The position was correct. She had seen that the position was a position. She had read the terrain the way a tracker reads terrain. She had identified, from the ambient configuration of the landscape, that someone who was watching this corridor would use this position. And she had gone around it. Kethvar watched her emerge on the far side and updated the model significantly. The model now said, "This mark is not running a standard me security protocol. This mark is doing something that requires a different category of assessment." She was tracking back. Not tracking Kethvar specifically. She didn't know Kethvar was there. She was reading the terrain as a tracker reads terrain and making decisions based on where. In this terrain, a threat would most likely be positioned. She was using a tracker's methodology to avoid a tracker she didn't know existed. Kethvar had encountered marks who had security training, marks who had combat training, marks who had wilderness survival training, 94 of them. None of them had done this. This was something else. Kethvar moved to the third position, which was the strongest of the three, and thought carefully. The third position required a significant approach because of its location. By the time Kethvar arrived, Rosen had a 4-hour lead and was moving at a pace that was eating into the margin the corridor's timeline constraints were supposed to provide. Kethvar moved faster than comfortable to compensate, which was a choice that carried its own costs. Moving fast in terrain that should be moved through carefully produced noise, and sign and the specific evidence of passage that careful movement avoided. Kethvar reached the third position and settled in and waited. The position covered the only viable approach to the relay station that satisfied the mark's timeline. The terrain on either side was genuinely impassable, not mapping data impassable. The approach was constrained. The window was defined. Rosen would come through here. Kethvar waited. 6 hours. 8. The timeline that the contract's analysis had suggested was expiring. Rosen did not appear. Kethvar held the position for 2 additional hours, past the point where the timeline should have forced the mark's hand, and then, for the first time in 22 years, broke position to investigate. The investigation required 3 hours of backtracking. What it found was evidence of a camp. A small camp, well concealed, placed in a location that was not on any transit line toward the relay station, a cold camp, recently vacated. Rosen had stopped. She had rested. She was not on the timeline that the analysis had predicted because she had recognized that the timeline constrained her transit options and had decided that the constraint was more dangerous than the delay. She had let the timeline expire, deliberately. She had bought herself a new option space, at the cost of the timeline that was supposed to close her option space down. Kethvar stood at the cold camp and looked at the evidence of it for a long time, then began tracking in earnest. Not positioning, actual tracking, following sign, reading the environment for the evidence of passage, that even careful movement left for someone who knew how to look. Rosen left sign. She was good, but she was not a tracker by primary training. There were things she didn't know to suppress. A broken stem here. A pressure mark there. The specific disturbance in ground litter that told Kethvar not just that she had passed, but how she had been moving when she passed. Weight distribution. Pace. The angle of her stride. She was moving carefully. Checking her back. Taking elevated positions when the terrain offered them. She was not running. She was hunting. The model updated again. She doesn't know I'm here, Kethvar thought. But she knows someone might be. And she's responding to the possibility of a tracker the way a tracker responds to the possibility of another tracker. How does she know to do that? This question was the most important question of the day, and Kethvar tracked and thought about it simultaneously. Day 2. The tracking had resolved into something that Kethvar did not have clean language for. Because it was not a category of engagement that 22 years and 94 marks had produced before. It was not pursuit. Pursuit meant the mark was ahead and the tracker was behind and the tracker was closing the gap. Kethvar was behind and closing, but Rosen was not simply ahead. She was active. She was reading the terrain as she moved through it and making decisions based on what the terrain suggested about where a threat might be. She was a variable that was responding to the hunt rather than simply being hunted. At 0600, Kethvar found where she had climbed a tree. Not a large tree. A specific tree at a specific elevation, chosen because from its upper branches you could see, through a gap in the canopy, a considerable stretch of the terrain she had already crossed. She had gone up that tree and looked back. She hadn't seen anything, because Kethvar's movement was too careful to produce visible sign at that distance. But she had looked. She was checking her back from elevation, not randomly, at a position where the sight lines were maximally useful. She had identified the position and used it the way a trained tracker used elevated observation. Where did she learn that? Kethvar climbed the same tree, from curiosity and from professional respect, and looked at what she had seen from there. The sight line was good. If Kethvar had been moving less carefully, it would have been revealing. It was the correct tree, chosen for the correct reasons. She had been taught this. Or she had figured it out. Either way, she knew. At 1100, Kethvar found where she had crossed a stream. The crossing was not at the obvious ford. The obvious ford was wide and shallow, and the crossing left clear sign in the disturbed stream. She had crossed 20 meters upstream at a point that required a longer jump, and that the approach too was rocky enough to leave minimal sign. She had landed on a rock on the far side, and moved from rock to rock for another 15 meters, before returning to soil, minimizing the trackable evidence of the crossing. Not eliminating it, Kethvar found the crossing, but minimizing it. She knew how streams were tracked. She was applying that knowledge to make herself harder to follow. At 1400, Kethvar found the first backtrack. Rosen had moved forward on her line for approximately 2 kilometers, then had reversed course for half a kilometer, then had cut perpendicular to her line for a considerable distance before resuming. The maneuver was a counter-tracking technique. Its purpose was to find or lose anyone following the original line. To find, because if someone was behind you and you reversed, you might see them. To lose, because if someone was tracking your sign rather than following directly, the reversal and cut would be a significantly longer route for them to follow. She had done this cleanly. The reversal point was at a rocky section that minimized the sign of turning. The cut was across terrain that left minimal track. Kethvar had encountered counter-tracking from trained marks before. Usually it was formal, pattern-based, the kind of technique that was taught as a discrete skill. This was not formal. It was integrated. It was terrain-responsive. She had chosen the reversal point based on the local terrain rather than based on a timed protocol. She was improvising, not from ignorance, but from knowledge deep enough to be flexible. The model, which had been updating continuously since day one, was now significantly different from the model that the dossier had produced. The dossier had said, "Standard me track with field certification." The model now said, "This is someone who was trained in a discipline that the dossier does not name." The field certification is real, but incomplete as a description. There is something underneath, the formal training that is older than the formal training. She moves through this terrain like someone who grew up in terrain like this. Where was she from? Kethvar had not researched this. The birthplace field in a dossier was usually irrelevant. It was relevant now. Kethvar pulled the dossier and found it. Rosen, Yael. Origin, Northern Negev, Earth. Kethvar had passing knowledge of Earth's geography, which was sufficient to know that the Northern Negev was a desert environment and that desert environments produced, in the people who grew up in them, a specific relationship to terrain, not jungle terrain, not this particular vegetation. But the underlying skills were transferable. The reading of landscape, the interpretation of what terrain said about water, on movement and visibility, the understanding of how to move through space, that was trying to be inhospitable without becoming legible. She had grown up in the desert. She had come to a different terrain and was applying desert tracking skills to it. They were working. Kethvar had tracked beings across difficult terrain many times, 94 times. The terrain was always a variable. The question was always how well the mark understood the terrain they were moving through. Rosen didn't fully understand this terrain. She was making errors that a specialist in this specific environment wouldn't make. Small errors. Errors that showed she was applying general principles rather than specific local knowledge. But the general principles were extremely good. Kethvar closed the gap through day 2 and camped 3 kilometers behind her estimated position, which was a closer gap than any previous day of any previous contract. But not close enough. Not yet. Day 3. Kethvar woke at 0400 and began tracking before full light, using the pre-dawn period when tracking sign was freshest and the mark, if she was sleeping, would not be moving. Found her camp at 0620, another cold camp. She had been moving since before dawn. The camp told a story that the camp's contents revealed to a careful eye. She had slept for approximately 4 hours, based on the compressed ground where she had lain. She had eaten from her pack. She had done something at the camp's edge that took a few minutes and left specific evidence. She had been studying the terrain she had already crossed. She had sat at the camp's edge, facing back along her route, for a period of time, and had left in the soil the specific marks of someone sitting in a focused posture for an extended period. She had been thinking about what was behind her, not because she had detected the tracking, because she had been thinking about the tracking that might be behind her, actively working through it, asking herself the questions that a tracker would ask about her passage. She was hunting her own trail, looking for what she had left that she shouldn't have, thinking about where she was trackable and adjusting her plan forward based on that analysis. Kethvar sat at the cold camp and read the evidence of this for a long time. 94 marks. Not one of them had done this. Not one of them had sat at their camp and hunted their own trail. They had run, or they had hidden, or they had fought, or they had cooperated. They had responded to the hunt. They had not thought about the hunt the way the hunter thought about it. Rosen was thinking about the hunt the way the hunter thought about it, from which followed a question that was uncomfortable in its implications. If she's thinking about the hunt the way the hunter thinks about it, what is she thinking right now? The answer came from the camp's evidence. She had studied her back trail, and she had decided something. Because the camp showed not just the sitting and the thinking, but also the decision. The gear had been repacked in a specific configuration that was different from the configuration it would have been in for the most direct route to the relay station. The exit line from the camp, readable in the first 50 meters, before she had applied her track suppression technique, was not toward the relay station. She was not going to the relay station. She was going somewhere else. Kethvar spent 20 minutes working out the geometry of where else she could be going, given the terrain, the regional infrastructure, the timeline that had already expired, and the decision that the camp's evidence suggested she had made. There was one answer that fit all of those constraints. She was not trying to reach the relay station anymore. She had concluded that the relay station route was compromised. Not because she had confirmed a specific threat, but because her analysis of her back trail had told her something she had taken seriously. She was going to ground, not fleeing. Going to ground with a purpose, which was to wait until the geometry changed. Until whoever might be behind her made a mistake that confirmed their position and gave her actionable information. Or until they concluded she was not reachable and withdrew. She was treating this like a tactical situation rather than a courier run. She had turned, somewhere in the previous 24 hours, from a mark who was trying to reach a destination into a mark who was trying to survive a hunt. And the way she was surviving the hunt was by applying the same analysis to it that the hunter applied. Kethvar tracked her through the morning. The sign was sparse now, sparser than the previous 2 days, because she had incorporated everything she had been thinking at the camp into her movement. She was making fewer of the small errors that general principles applied to specific terrain produced. She was learning the terrain as she moved through it. A 3-day course in local tracking taught by the terrain itself and by her own analytical attention. At 1400 Kethvar lost the trail. This was the first time in 22 years that this had happened. not lost it in the sense of a temporary gap that further search would resolve. Lost it in the sense that the trail ended and the surrounding terrain held no continuation. She had done something at this point that produced no readable sign in any direction. Kethvar spent for hours searching the surrounding area in expanding circles. Nothing. The trail ended at a rocky section adjacent to a stream and did not resume on the far bank, on the upstream sections, on the downstream sections, in the tree lines, in any direction. She had been here. She was no longer trackable from here. Kethvar stood at the end of the trail as the light began to fail and held. For the first time in 22 years, the specific experience of a number that was not going to increment. Not yet. Possibly not at all. The communication came at 0200 on day 4. Kethvar was camped at the trail's end, in the position that any experienced tracker would camp because it was the position that controlled the most terrain and because, if Rosen came back through this area, this was the position that would show it. The communication came through the field unit's general receive channel, which was a channel that accepted open transmissions from any source within range. It said, "I know you're there." Kethvar was very still. The voice was calm. Not the calm of someone performing calm. The calm of someone who had been in a difficult situation for 3 days and had found a stable relationship with it. "I've been thinking about this since day 2, the voice continued. "I knew something was wrong on day 1 because of the first position. I didn't see you. But I saw that the position was a position, and I saw that it was correctly chosen, and that told me whoever was using it was very good." She's paused. By day 2, I was confident enough in my read of the situation to start operating accordingly. Kethvar did not respond, did not need to. She was talking to the terrain, to whoever might be in it, which was the correct approach when you knew someone was there, but not exactly where. "I've done my research," she said. Kethvar, 94 marks, 22 years, no failures. That's a real record, which means you're a real professional, which means you have a real methodology. She paused. "I've been thinking about your methodology for 2 days. I think I understand it reasonably well at this point." Kethvar listened. "The contract is alive and intact," she said. "That constrains your approach significantly. Dead would be easier. Alive and intact means you need margin. You need precision. You can't just wait for an opportunity. You need a controlled opportunity." She paused. "I've been denying you controlled opportunities. That's the only play I have." She paused again. "I can keep doing it. I know this terrain now, in a way I didn't on day 1. I can keep this going for some time." Kethvar thought about the lost trail. About for hours of search, producing nothing. About a mark who had gone from field-certified me specialist to something else across 3 days of being hunted. "But," she said, "I want to talk to you, not to negotiate surrender." She was quiet for a moment, "to make you an offer." Kethvar broke cover at 0300, not because the offer compelled it, because the professional calculus had shifted in a way that required direct engagement to resolve, and direct engagement required presence. Rosen was where Kethvar would have been, in the position that controlled the most terrain at the stream junction. She was sitting with her back to a rock and her front to the open ground, which was also where Kethvar would have sat. She looked at Kethvar approaching and did not move. Her hands were visible. She had made the calculation that visible hands were the correct signal for this conversation. "You're smaller than I expected," she said. Kethvar sat down on the far side of the open ground, at a distance that was conversational and not tactical, mirrored the visible hands. "You were larger in the sign you left," Kethvar said. Which was true. The sign of someone moving with this level of attention and decision-making was the sign of a larger presence than the physical parameters in the dossier suggested. Rosen almost smiled. Then, The contract is from the Dominion. It was not a question. Kethvar did not confirm or deny. The data I'm carrying, she said. It's intercept documentation on a Dominion intelligence network that's been running inside the Concordance for 3 years. 17 embedded assets, their current positions, their current operational focus. She looked at Kethvar directly. If it reaches the relay station, the network ends and those 17 assets are burned. She paused. The Dominion contracted you to prevent that. Kethvar was quiet. You knew the client type when you took the contract, Rosen said. Not specifically, but generally. High value intelligence courrier. Anonymous client, can't payment. The profile is readable if you know what to read. She paused. I think you know what to read. Still quiet. Here's the offer, she said. She reached into her pack and produced a sealed data case, which she set on the ground between them and did not move her hands toward. The case has a copy of the intercept documentation, the complete file. If it reaches any Concordance intelligence relay, the network ends. She paused. I'm offering to split the contract value with you. The data reaches its destination. You receive payment. You report to your client that the mark was not retrievable and retire the contract. Kethvar looked at the case. Your record ends at 94, Rosen said, but 94 is still the record. And you retire intact, with payment. What's the alternative? Get your side. She looked at Kethvar with the direct, clear attention she had been maintaining since the beginning of this conversation. We keep going. She paused. You're better at this than I am. Over enough time, you'll find a controlled opportunity. Maybe. She paused. Or you don't, and you return to the client with a failed contract for the first time in 22 years, which is a different kind of record. She looked at the case again. Or we make a deal, and both of us get something. Kethvar looked at her for a long time. At the woman who had read the first position from the terrain configuration alone. Who had let the contract timeline expire, deliberately to expand her option space. Who had hunted her own trail from a cold camp and incorporated the results into her movement in real time. Who had lost Kethvar's track on day 3 in a way that for hours of search had not resolved. Who had then found Kethvar's position on day 4 and opened communications from a conversational distance. Who had made this offer from a position of knowing exactly what she was worth as a mark and exactly what Kethvar's alternatives were. Standard me track with field certification. The dossier had been wrong in the way that dossiers were sometimes wrong, not in the facts, but in what the facts meant. The field certification was accurate. The standard was not. Nothing about this mark was standard. Kethvar said, the offer case, payment, and what else? Rosen looked at her carefully. What else are you looking for? The answer was not something Kethvar had known before this conversation. It had become clear somewhere in the past for hours. In the sitting at the end of a trail that had simply stopped, in the thinking about what had produced that stopping. I want to know how you did the trail end on day 3, Kethvar said. The clean break. For hours of search produced nothing. Rosen was quiet for a moment. Then, that's a knowledge transfer, not a payment, yes. She thought about it. You could replicate it. That's why I want it. Another silence. Then, you want to learn from this. The most significant tracking engagement in 22 years had just ended in a stalemate, not a failure. A stalemate, which was different. The mark was a professional in a discipline she had not claimed on her dossier that had developed somewhere between the northern Negev and 3 days of being hunted through difficult terrain. She had things Kethvar wanted. Not just the trail end. That was the specific. The general was the methodology, the active engagement approach to being hunted. The real-time terrain learning, the hunter's analysis turned on the hunter. Kethvar had been on one side of this for 22 years. It was time to understand the other side, from someone who had just demonstrated it at a level no previous mark had come close to. The alternative, Kethvar said carefully, is we continue. You're right that over enough time I find the opportunity. I also think you're right that it's not certain and not quick. She paused. But there's a third option that's not in your offer. Rosen waited. I don't work for the Dominion again, Kethvar said. I've worked for them 3 times. The contracts are well-paying and the clients are specific about requirements in ways I've found professionally manageable. She paused. This contract I took without sufficient research into the intelligence context, which is an error I'm disinclined to repeat. She looked at Rosen directly. The data case reaches its destination. Your 17 assets are protected. I report a failed contract and retire this engagement. She paused. And you, tell me how you did the trail end. Rosen looked at her. That's the same deal. No, Kethvar said. Your deal was financial. Mine is different. Rosen looked at the data case. Then at Kethvar. What's the difference? The difference, Kethvar said, is that I'm not taking your money. I'm asking to learn something. That's a different transaction. Rosen was quiet for a long moment. She was thinking about something. And she had the specific, thoughtful quality of someone who was reconsidering the framing of a situation. Then she said, you want to come in. Kethvar did not answer immediately. The question was direct enough to require a direct answer, and the direct answer required knowing what the question meant. You've been independent for 22 years, Rosen said. 94 contracts. Clients who paid for a record. She paused. The Dominion contract was the 3rd time you worked for them, and you just said you wouldn't do it again. That's a values statement, not just a preference. She looked at her carefully. And you're sitting here at 0300 asking to learn something from the mark you was sent to take. That's not a financial transaction. That's something else. Kethvar looked at her. What are you actually asking for? Rosen said. A different kind of work, Kethvar said, from a different kind of client. Rosen was quiet for a long time. Then she picked up the data case and put it back in her pack. She said, I can't promise anything. I can take you in with me and make an introduction. The rest is up to you and up to them. She paused. What I can tell you is that the work is real and the clients don't contract against their own people. She looked at Kethvar across the open ground between them. And I'll tell you how I did the trail end. When? Now, she said. It's a long walk to the relay station and we have time. She stood up, adjusting her pack. The trail end, she said, starting to move, is mostly about understanding how tracks are found. You track by looking for disturbance. So the goal is to pass through a space in a way that produces no disturbance anywhere in the accessible area. She paused. The stream was the key. You search the banks on both sides. But the stream itself has a substrate. If you know the substrate composition and the current speed and the turbulence pattern, Kethvar fell into step beside her, listening. Behind them, the terrain was quiet. No sign of passage from either direction. 2 professionals moving through space they had both learned to read. Toward a relay station, carrying data that would end a network and begin something that neither of them had fully planned for. The galaxy's best tracker had hunted a mark for 3 days, and at the end of the 3 days had found, instead of a mark, something more useful, a teacher, and a reason to take a different kind of contract. Rosen talked. Kethvar listened. The walk to the relay station took for hours. By the end of it, Kethvar understood the trail end. The first thing learned was the trail end. The second thing learned, over the course of 4 hours of walking and talking with someone who moved through terrain the way very few beings moved through terrain, was that the dossier had always been the wrong place to look. The right place to look was the terrain. And what it said about the being moving through it, 94 marks. All read correctly. One more. Read correctly in a way that the reading had not been expected to go. The record, Kethvar thought, as the relay station's lights appeared on the horizon, was more interesting than it had been 3 days ago. That, too, was a first.